I'll get started because I think in talking about anything having to do with Israel-Palestine, we need to understand that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which is what's going on, is not some arrogant policy of a particularly right-wing administration inside of Israel, but in fact, is actually the logical ramification of a colonial settler state. And I would not ask you to take my word for it. In fact, the architects and the leadership of the state of Israel describes themselves in this way. Describes themselves as an apartheid state, describes themselves as a colonial settler state. This is from, I'll explain to you as I start reading the quote, who it is. The Intifada, this was in 2002. The Intifada is the Palestinian people's war of national liberation, wrote former Israeli Attorney General Michael Ben-Yair in 2002 in Israel's Haaretz newspaper, which is sort of the New York Times of Israel, referring to the Palestinian uprising of that year. He goes on to say, "We enthusiastically chose to become a colonialist society, ignoring international treaties, expropriating lands, transferring settlers from Israel to the occupied territories, engaging in theft, and finding justification for all of these activities. We established an apartheid regime." That is the Attorney General of the State of Israel. So I think when you begin to understand that Israel is a colonial settler state, then you have to understand what the ramifications of colonization of a settler state, of an outside grouping of people who come to not only settle in that land, but actually expropriate the people, the population from that land. Because it follows from colonization, dispossession, racism, and brutal suppression of the indigenous population. And there are many, many parallels in some ways between what happened under apartheid South Africa and what happens in Israel. There are many parallels. In fact, the relationship between the Israeli state and the South African state, it goes back a very long ways. In fact, back in the 1950s, the editorial pages of Haaretz describe themselves as a watchdog state for US imperialism in the Middle East. And what they said is, should the United States choose to look the other way, we will perform acts behind closed doors that the United States government cannot openly give approval to. For example, training the death squads in Guatemala during the brutal regimes there of the 1970s and 80s. Training and working alongside of the brutal South African police force under apartheid regime. The relationship between these states has been extremely close all along. However, while both of these states were colonial settler states, and therefore sort of the same genus, they are not of the same species exactly, because there were differences between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid. And the most fundamental difference, and I'll explain why this is important, has to do with actually the mode of production. Because if you understand what happened in South Africa, the black workforce, which of course was the overwhelming majority of the state of South Africa throughout all time, was fundamental to the ability for the South African state to perform mining, to reap a surplus, a profit, and all the rest of that. However, in Israel, you don't have that same relationship. The relationship between the Jewish settlers who largely came from Europe and then later on were brought in from around the Middle East, the Mizrahi Jews and the Sephardic Jews, as well as the Ashkenazi Jews, which are the European Jews, which is the majority of the American Jewish population who have come from European stock, actually didn't choose to exploit the Palestinian Arab population, but actually to completely displace the Palestinian population. So the Palestinians are not exploited by the state of Israel, they are simply being removed by the state of Israel. They are in the way. In fact, they talk about ethnic cleansing, although they use, as the Attorney General used that language, instead of using ethnic cleansing, not a particularly friendly term, they use the term transfer. And so when you understand that fundamental difference, it begins to give you an idea about the different power relations, because whereas the miners of South Africa could actually undo apartheid through their own self-activity by going on strike, by threatening the state, by organizing, by unionizing, and by ultimately, overthrowing the old apartheid regime and replacing it with a new regime. That is not a possibility among the Palestinians inside of the occupied territories or in the diaspora at large, who do not actually provide the wealth for the state of Israel. In fact, they have been completely driven out of the workforce. In fact, it wasn't even just the project of the right-wing Israeli Zionist state. In fact, it was left to what is often referred to as left Zionists, although I think in some ways that's an oxymoron, because the logic of left-wing Zionism is to give a progressive gloss to a racist regime. And so it was actually the trade union movement in Israel, the Histadrut, that from the very beginning, from Zionism's origins, had Jewish-only workforce, had a ban on Jews, and would actually beat up or destroy produce that was brought in and attempted to be, and grown by Palestinian workers. They would actually drive Palestinian labor out, unlike any other union movement the world over, which aims to create solidarity and break down divisions that are stoked consciously by the ruling class. In fact, the trade union movement in Israel is part of stoking those divisions, those racial divisions, and keeping the Palestinian Arab population away. So that is a very important distinction between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid. I think there's a usefulness in using the term apartheid with both regimes, but we must understand that fundamental difference, because in that fundamental difference of the fact that the Palestinians are left out, as an African revolutionary once put it, if there's anything worse than being exploited by capitalism, it's not being exploited by capitalism. It's not being able to actually earn a living. It's not being able to have a social place in the order and make your way in the world. And I think it has implications, because it means that Palestinians must have the solidarity of not only their brothers and sisters throughout the region, but their brothers and sisters right here inside of the US empire, which actually supplies and supports the state of Israel to the tune of $3 billion in direct aid and several billion dollars more in loan guarantees and military aid and all the rest of that every year, not because of a powerful Jewish lobby, as powerful as the AIPAC is, the American Israeli Political Action Committee is obviously quite powerful and quite vocal in this country, but it doesn't support the state of Israel because of a handful of noisy Zionists, but actually because it is part of the imperial logic of this nation. As Alexander Haig, the former Secretary of State of the United States, put it so eloquently, the American ruling class conceives of the state of Israel as an aircraft carrier for US imperialism. Again, that's the American ruling class's words describing the role of Israel, not the left. And so we need to understand that, because our solidarity is actually crucial to being able to help move forward the project of an end to this apartheid system in Israel and take steps forward towards the liberation of our brothers and sisters, not only inside of Gaza and the West Bank, but the millions of Palestinians who live across the world. Now, I want to say a few words in terms of lessons that I learned, having been a part of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the divestment struggle in the 1980s as a college student, because like you, I became a radical in college. But unlike you, I became a radical in college at a time when Ronald Reagan was on the ascendancy, when young gay men were dying by initially the dozens and the hundreds by a disease at that point known as gay-related infectious disease, later known as AIDS, and in a period in which the left was on the retreat and the right was on the rise. We now have a circumstance that is obviously turned upside down, thank God. Things are a hell of a lot more promising, and yet in that moment, we were still able to organize on different campuses, like my own, hundreds of students that built encampments, occupations, and presented enough of a credible threat and a credible political analysis that made it no longer possible for universities and for other institutions to continue to support apartheid South Africa. And one of the things that I think we learned is that you cannot separate strategy from politics. That actually knowing history, understanding some politics, and having theory is not sort of an added extra, a nice thing, but actually crucial in your ability to devise tactics in order to win. And so, I mean, even in the occupation that you guys had here at Rochester, with SDS folks and CAN folks and other people, I was talking to Kyle from the ISO who was saying it was because I read Teamster Rebellion about the sit-down strikes of the 1930s in Minneapolis, which was the birth of the Teamster Union, that I learned about the idea of flying pickets to sort of put forward the idea that students should go to different cafes to go get solidarity and win other support. Understanding, using things like books. Books are weapons. These are some of our most potent weapons in the struggle. We need to read them, absorb them, debate out ideas, in order to move forward and hammer out strategies. The other thing